first start by saying what an honor it is to be here at the Renwick, and what an honor it is to be in the grace of these other three amazing artists. I think it's interesting that clay has always had this kind of backseat to the other crafts and certainly the arts, despite it having its long-standing tradition in every people's history. And there's only one place in the world that doesn't have a local source of clay. Anybody happen to know where that is? Anybody? It's a good guess. Hawaii. You may know why Hawaii doesn't have clay. This is a teacher in me. It's not old enough. That's why. It takes time to make clay. So most places where there's a cultural history and a tradition of making clay, it's because there's a history of erosion and activity. The places that are new where there isn't clay. I like to use clay and process and things like that as metaphors for thinking about process and material and craft. I think one of the things that is challenging to talk about as it pertains to this show is there's about 20 years worth of work in this room. Some of you know I've been working in clay since I was 14, and I was about 15 years old when I decided that this is what I want to do with my life. And I met visiting artists at the program I was in, and these guys have made mud and told stories and traveled the world. And I kind of looked at those people as models for getting where I wanted to go. There are some new talking points that have kind of emerged from the last couple of days and also some recent lectures. But one scholar said that he talked about the word craft and coming from the German word craft that means power. A lot of times I like to think about the relationship of process and how one hones one's energies. The other metaphor that I like to use, and maybe it gives an opportunity for me to kind of brag about physique, but is the metaphor of exercise. And there are a lot of people who think about things in boxes. They say, I want to get in shape. We have our kind of New Year's resolution people who show up with their gym bags and their memberships, and they're gone in March, right? And one of the reasons that happens is because we have a difficult time thinking about how we fit certain practices in our life. And honing power and energy is an important practice to cultivate the human spirit. So how do we do that? Some people do that through yoga, some people do it through exercise, some people do it through prayer, some people do that through various kinds of making. But for me, and like the same thing in physical fitness, I don't think that it's an all or nothing deal. So if you can't get in there at 5 a.m., maybe you can do some jumping jacks before bed. And I wear a lot of hats, or I've worn a lot of different hats over the last 20 years, but all along I've been a potter and artist. So what does it look like when I'm an academic and an artist? What does it look like when I'm a father and an artist? What does it look like when I'm a teacher and an artist? What does it look like when I'm a college kid and an artist? So the iterations of ideas you see in this room are just that. It's me trying to find a way to hone power and energy, to pay respect to traditions and legacies and peoples from various cultures and various times, because all of that belongs to all of us. So, one might think, what is the relationship between a bowl like this that's very quiet and simplistic and 1,500 heads in a pile that's fragmented? And one of the answers is that it's a different chapter in my life. It necessitates a different rhythm of making and a different nod to a different history and a different material and a different technique. Sometimes I still teach pottery, and when I teach pottery, I become a full-time potter. So these are examples of me making pots, me demonstrating possibilities for students, but me also being invested as a maker and as a professional in what that means for the purpose of my students' development. So I'm not going to say try this on for size. I'm going to say try these on for size for this many weeks, and I'm going to make them in conjunction with them. So if we're making cover jars, I'm going to be making cover jars with them, and I'm going to make that what I do. Speaking of working in spaces, this series started in '99, and I learned that I can make things in a very unintrusive way that are around the size of a tennis ball or a naval launch. And that kind of started this trajectory where I'm working at home, I'm working with the kids, I'm I'm working in my office, I'm working in the classroom, and as a result of some of these early ideas of working intimately in this scale by hand with limited facility, started work where I found that I can be prolific despite the complexities and demands of certain aspects of my life, particularly as a father or a student working on his dissertation. That kind of spanned into, there's also vestiges of this piece where I'm fragmenting works and working in multiple kinds of clay in conjunction with one project. So you'll also see works where, like the ones back in this area, where I'm using fragments and reconfiguring fragments. I like to think of that as reclaiming histories. And sometimes I'll do that reclaiming my own work, where I'm compiling fragments of things that I made sometimes 20 years ago. And other times I'm reclaiming fragments from an old pottery factory, or simply going to Dollar General or Family Dollar and buying a bunch of orange plates and breaking them up and reconfiguring those as well. The pinch pot also kind of spanned this series that's been ongoing for about 10 years or so now, and that's the series that involves this idea of adornment, that also in many ways deals with these same questions of history, of globalization, of power, where I'm making these conceptual necklaces, many of which are made at home. So this idea that if I make a piece this small 100 times, or in this case 150 times, when I get ready to compile that composition with steel and vinyl and rubber, it results in a composition like this. But the idea is that at one point or another, this piece was in crates and in boxes all over the house, just like this one, or in my studio in my office. So I want to add that I continue to revisit pottery making for the same purpose that I originally did, and that's to kind of find a quiet place. I told somebody recently that for me, art making is sometimes about cultivating peace, and art making sometimes is about creating unnecessary chaos, so I can find kind of a calmness within a storm. I liken it often to talking to myself. I go in the studio and I cultivate energy, and eventually that energy starts to speak to me. In the case of this piece, I really just started out making a pile of heads. I didn't have this big idea of what it would be about, and thinking about the extension meaning of making a vessel, of making information and then hiding information, of making information and then fragmenting information, and using those things as metaphors for how we think about identity over generations and through transit. And I like to think that those ideas are also consistent throughout the work. But one of the things that this work all continues to come back to is my personal history as not only a potter and one who's had a pottery apprenticeship, but also my personal history as an art student and a student of the world. So that's also a part of my repertoire, seeing art, being an art student, being an art professor, and giving a nod to things I collect and things I encounter as a student and as a teacher. Which time I got to come over?
You got another minute.
Oh, perfect. So in summation, the more recent, I talk a lot in my work about rhythms and having different rhythms of making and thinking about how those rhythms engage different kinds of spaces. And this is why I'm so excited to have all this work together, because the time and energy investment, like it or not, work becomes commodity. And what does that mean to the market? What does that mean to sell an object that is unique? And comparing an object like this that was sold out in my front yard to a waitress, it's now at the Smithsonian for $150, to an object that requires a grant-funded residency, like these glass works that I made, that also involves pinch potting in its origin. So, to me, it's interesting to kind of push back on what those markets mean, and that's one of the reasons I like to sell pots out of my front yard for $30 to $300, because it really pushes a different kind of engagement. While I would love to have gallery openings at the Smithsonian every week, the kinds of conversations that we have in places like this are limited compared to a 16-hour booth that I would have over 3 days in a weekend in my front yard. And I think that the pushing back on the hierarchies of not just consumption and engagement, but pushing back on the hierarchies of who deserves access to arts and enriching lives, and conversations about how we cultivate power is a critical conversation that should be an ongoing one.
Perfect.